Villeneuve is 3 seconds behind Villeneuve.
In 1997, Formula 1 held a race at the Nürburgring in Germany, but there was a problem. What to call it? They couldn't call it the German Grand Prix, because that was already held at the Hockenheimring, and normally that would mean they'd instead call it the European Grand Prix, a name with a lot of history and prestige, but they couldn't call it that either, as that was already taken up by a second race in Spain. As a result, they bafflingly decided to name it after a place where it wasn't, and so we ended up with the first ever Formula 1 Luxembourg Grand Prix. In researching this, I was surprised to find out that there did genuinely used to be a Grand Prix held in Luxembourg, as a non-championship sports car and Formula 3 race held from 1949 to 1952 at a temporary circuit next to Findel Airport. In this particular video, we are of course looking at the 1997 race, held during one of the tensest championship battles of all time. Michael Schumacher came into the race leading the championship by just 1 point, although he couldn't quite hook up a good lap in qualifying, so that allowed his rival Mika Häkkinen to take his very first pole position. Second on the grid, and less than a tenth of a second back, was title protagonist Jacques Villeneuve, just ahead of his Williams teammate Heinz-Harald Frentzen. Fourth on the grid was an impressively high-placed Jordan of Giancarlo Fisichella, and fifth place was Michael Schumacher. In all honesty, Ferrari seemed to be struggling as a whole in qualifying, with Eddie Irvine starting all the way down in 14th position, but then again this was Eddie Irvine, so you never quite knew where he'd be. When the race began, both McLarens got an excellent start, with Häkkinen leading and Coulthard challenging for second. Then the two Williamses touched wheels but miraculously survived, but there was a crash involving both Jordans and Michael Schumacher. Wow! Gerhard Berger ran through the gravel as well, but kept the car pointing in the right direction, unlike Ukyo Katayama who spun at the back. Heinz-Harald Frentzen was also badly affected by the chaos and dropped right into the mid-pack, and at the end of the first lap it was Häkkinen leading from Coulthard, Villeneuve, Barrichello in the Stewart, Alesi, and then Magnussen up from 12th on the grid. On the replay you can see that the accident was ironically caused by Ralf Schumacher, who got too much of the curb and hit both his teammate and his brother. That's like a tag team of motorsport cardinal sins. I wonder what his favourite Linkin Park song is. Friendly Fire? Dramatically, Michael, Ralf, Giancarlo and Ukyo were all forced to retire from the race, meaning the championship leader would come away from this race with 0 points. It's amazing to think that the famous Jerez finale may have been totally different had this crash not happened. Ralf may well have contributed to his brother losing the championship. One thing that the early drama did do was put several contenders well out of position, forcing them to fight their way through the midfield. What you just saw was Berger completing a move on Parnis for 10th, and there's Frentzen getting up into 11th place after his issues. To be honest, it's really hard to see why Heinz-Harald ended up so far down the order in the first place. It's possible that his car went into anti-stall after the contact with Villeneuve, and it's also possible that he got a touch from one of the Jordans during the melee. Whatever the case, points only went down to 6th place in those days, so chop chop. As the race continued through the smoke of Nakano's engine, look who else was on fire. Mika Häkkinen led the race by a whole 11 seconds ahead of his teammate after just 18 laps. It's also worth noting that while Villeneuve was still behind Coulthard, he wasn't actually being held up. The Williams may have been the dominant car of this era overall, but in this specific race there was a new car on top. With that being said though, Frentzen was far from giving up. Here he is passing Diniz for 9th place, as up ahead you're about to see Gerhard Berger pitting from 7th. Both of the Benettons pitted relatively early in this race, with Alesi having already been in. On lap 23, out of the race went Eddie Irvine with an engine failure. He'd been running outside of the points anyway, but this retirement meant that Ferrari would get absolutely nothing from the race. Considering that the Scuderia were already 12 points behind Williams, who still had both cars in the race, this was effectively the final nail in the coffin for their Constructors' Championship hopes, especially with just 2 races remaining. Not very grazie ragazzi, I'm afraid to say. Back to the race, Frentzen was fast approaching the driver he had controversially replaced at Williams, and Hill knew that he was vulnerable. Look at him swarming all over the back of Jan Magnussen, who was running 5th. To be honest, it's incredible to see Stewart running so highly in a race in '97, as they'd had such a tough start to their time in F1. Up until this point, their only points had come in the form of a podium finish in Monaco, but usually they had to fight just to finish the race. Barrichello and Magnussen were doing an absolutely superb job here, even if Hill and Frentzen were clearly faster. Anyway, into the pits came Mika Hakkinen from the lead for the first of his 2 scheduled stops, and he was followed in quickly by Villeneuve. This demonstrated the lead that Hakkinen had built up, as he had finished his refueling and dumped the clutch before Villeneuve even reached his box. Hakkinen's stop was 6.9 seconds, which beat Villeneuve's 8.8 seconds and further extended his gap. However, it did mean that the Williams driver may have been fueled to go deeper into the race, so watch this space. And watch this terrible pit stop for Hill. The world champion stalled the arrows, finally giving Magnussen some breathing room. Oh dear Damon. Meanwhile, David Coulthard had also made a stop, so the order was once again Hakkinen leading from Coulthard, Villeneuve, Barrichello and Magnussen. Damon eventually rejoined the race, but a very long way down and outside of the top 10. Here's a tight situation involving the other arrows. Pedro Diniz there jinking past Jan Magnussen on pit exit, and it quickly became clear that Magnussen had a problem as Johnny Herbert passed him easily. Unfortunately for the Stewart driver, his half shaft had broken during the pit stop and he would retire from the race. A Stewart retiring in 97? What a surprise. By the way, I should quickly address that Diniz clearly cut the pit exit line and nearly came out right in front of Herbert, but if you're wondering if he would get a penalty for that, the answer is no, because F1 didn't start policing pit exits for another few years, so it's all fair. Back to the race, there was another staller in the pits, and it was Gianni Morbidelli in what would turn out to be his very last start in F1, as he unfortunately picked up a broken wrist in a nasty qualifying crash at Suzuka, and then went to touring car racing from 1998. He continued racing right up until 2019, winning several championships along the way. It's good to know that he won't be remembered just as an average F1 driver, as he deserves better than that. No one with talent deserves to have their careers just go up in smoke, just like we're seeing. Wait a minute, that's not a doomed F1 career, that's an engine! Specifically the Mercedes engine of David Coulthard, who had been running in second place! An absolute disaster for David after such a good drive. Now, listen to this delightful foreshadowing from the ever-prophetic Murray Walker.
One has to say, if it's happened to one Mercedes engine, it could happen to the other.
Has Hakkinen got a problem with this car? Because, yes he has! Hakkinen is out of the race!
And just like that, a 1-2 went down the loo. Both McLarens were out of the race just one lap apart, victims of Mercedes engines failing on their home soil. To be honest, he was pretty lucky not to get hit by Johnny Herbert on pit exit, as the pit lane speed limit here was 120 km per hour, and he did pull over rather quickly. Villeneuve now suddenly led the race ahead of Rubens Barrichello, except no! Out goes Rubens as well! Not only had both McLarens literally blown strong results, but both stewards had as well. What a disaster! This now meant that Lacey was second, followed by Berger, Frentzen and Diniz. Oh my goodness! And there, walking dejectedly back to the pits, is the birthday boy. Yes, this race really was held on his 29th birthday, which would have been a perfect time for him to take his first Grand Prix victory. It wasn't to be this time, but he would end up winning the last race of the season and the first 2 races of 1998 to make up for it, so I think that's a present worth waiting for. Back to a little bit of normality, the second pit window was ongoing. By this point the Benettons had stopped, so the last loose end was the Williamses. As you can see, Frentzen found himself between the Benettons in 3rd place, but it was a lot closer than before and seemed to set up an exciting race for the podium. As for Villeneuve, he'd built up enough of a gap to pit and maintain the lead, which is exactly what he did a lap later. With only 10 cars remaining, there was a great scrap for 5th place between Diniz, Parnis and Herbert, with Parnis jinking around to try to scare Diniz off his line. It's worth noting that this was actually the race in which Parnis returned from injury after his horrible crash in Montreal, which I covered in a previous episode. Olivier was still limping in the paddock, and there were fears that he might not be able to exit his car in a fast enough time to be allowed to race, but whatever pain he was in didn't appear to be affecting him too much in this race, as he was on for a point. His season reminds me a lot of Michael Schumacher's 1999, a great comeback story, tainted by the question of what could have been had the accidents not happened at all. In the end, it was Jacques Villeneuve who came through to win by 11 seconds, even though he'd been leading by nearly half a minute before taking it super easy in the last few laps. While no one would have believed it at the time, this would actually end up being Villeneuve's last win in Formula 1, but it was arguably his most important because it gave him a championship lead that he would carry right the way to the title. Second in the race was Lacey, despite starting 10th on the grid, and third was Frentzen, despite having dropped back massively at the start. Fourth was Berger on his own recovery drive, and fifth was Pedro Diniz in his only points finish of the season. P6 was Olivier Panis, who couldn't quite get past the Aries in the end, but could still be very proud of his effort to return to F1 in the points after his horrible leg injuries. Also finishing the race were Johnny Herbert and Damon Hill, and then a lap down were Gianni Morbidelli and Mika Salo. Only 10 cars finished in total, as the 90s took their signature toll on the field. Guys, before I give this race a score, I want to let you know that I have a Daily Motion channel where I upload all the videos that get taken down from YouTube by the pesky FOM bots. While I accept that FOM owns the rights to the race footage I use, I believe that all of my videos fall under fair use due to the high levels of parody, commentary and review, and I always encourage people to watch Formula 1 live in order to better appreciate this great sport. Sadly, this isn't always enough. I also occasionally stream on Twitch, where you can chat to me live, so I've included the links to both my Daily Motion and my Twitch channel in the description of this video. Thank you. I gave the Grand Prix an 8 out of 10 overall, for its extreme unpredictability and its championship finale-like feel. To be honest, it was only really held down by how difficult it was to pass on this track, but I think the arena section they brought in for 2002 worked wonders on solving this issue. A fun fact about this race is that it was a little bit of a swan song for Renault engines in F1, as the top 4 cars were all Renault powered, something that wouldn't happen again until the 2012 Bahrain Grand Prix. Renault would actually pull out of F1 at the end of '97, before eventually returning in 2001 with Benetton. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Pedro Diniz for climbing from 15th place to 5th and then holding off the faster cars of Panis and Herbert. Obviously an honourable mention goes to Mika Hakkinen, who clearly would have won this race had his engine not failed. I'll give the Inouye Trophy for Worst Driver to Ralf Schumacher for his Turn 1 shenanigans and the fact that he took out the GOAT of Formula 1, by which I obviously mean Ukyo Katayama. Drive safely guys, and I'll see you next time.